Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 5, Halacha 1. This is a two-part shiur because this will be 2 pages. And we're doing a page today and then a page tomorrow. So the Mishnah is going to talk about something special. What happens when you have a kind of tree where you're going to have Sheviis, but where the fruit takes longer to grow, and then it will come ripe for picking in a year after Sheviis. So, for instance, sometimes there are etrogim that will blossom. We know that except for carobs, it's when the fruit starts to blossom on the tree, starts to emerge, and it might happen in the 7th year, but etrogs are very, very slow to grow, and you might only be picking it in the year after. So, is that etrog going to have Sheviis sanctity or not? It's the 8th year, but it started to emerge in the 7th year. So that's what we're going to be covering now. So the Mishnah says, Bonos Shuach, their Sheviis is the 2nd year after Sheviis because they produce fruit over 3 years. Now, Bonos Shuach are white figs. That, by the way, is defined in Avodah Zarah 14a, in the Bavli. And normally, fruit is going to be there and be ready the same year they emerge. So when you go up to the north in Eretz Yisrael and you go and you see all the peach groves, those peach groves in the winter are not sitting there with fruit from the earlier year. Sometime around Tu B'Shvat, they will start to blossom, and then they will have fruit that will be ready for picking and perfect and delicious sometime in the 2nd week and 3rd week of August. So most trees are like that. They are not going to carry over fruit from earlier years. But these white figs do. And so you can have it where they've emerged, they've started in the Sheviis year, and then you're only picking them in year 9. So it's year 9, and you're picking these white figs that emerged in the Sheviis year. Question is, are they going to have sanctity or not? Now, this is saying that their Sheviis is the 2nd year after Sheviis because they produce the fruit over 3 years. So what this is saying is that, yes, in this other year, even in the 2nd year, 2 years later in year 9, these are going to have Sheviis sanctity because this emerged in the Sheviis cycle. And yes, you're picking it in the 2nd year of the Sheviis cycle, in year 9, but it still has the sanctity. That's really what's interesting. Now, the question here is that the Mishnah has to be teaching something new. And we learned in the last Mishnah at the end of chapter 4 that there's a special rule for carob trees. Carob trees are not like the others because it's not when the fruit emerges. For carob trees, it's when they hang like chains. And over here, the question is going to be that, well, what new thing is this Mishnah trying to teach? Every Mishnah has to teach something new and a new novelty in the law. It can't just restate things. It never does. It's always going to be something in there that you have to try to figure out because there is a novelty in the law. And the idea is that over here, the Bonos Shuach, these white figs that come about during Sheviis, are not being picked until the 9th year. And so the question is, why is this needed to teach this law? And the idea is that Sheviis is going to apply only to fruits that ripen in the same year that they emerge. And that was, originally what the law was. But ultimately, the rabbis changed it, and they decided that even if the fruits emerge during Sheviis but don't ripen until later on, that they're going to be subject to Sheviis laws. Now, how can this be? Well, the idea is that Sheviis on fruit is going to be d'Rabbanan. So so some of the idea is that this is teaching something where originally it was thought that since these white figs do not ripen in the same year that they emerge, they should not be assigned to when they emerge, but rather when they're picked. Okay, that was the original law, and you can see this in the Tosafot in Shavuot 12b. And the idea is that they took a vote and they changed this. Okay, so there's some subtlety, and that's why this is a little bit different. Okay, now the Mishnah is going to consider another type of tree and whether that's going to have a similar law. And Rabbi Yehuda says that Pasos, their Sheviis is the year after Sheviis because they produce fruit over 2 years. So Pasos are Persian dates, and it's a special kind of Persian date palm. And you can see the definition for that in Bavli Shabbos 29a, where it's talking about dates over there. And the Parsaus, their Sheviis is the year after Sheviis, and they produce fruit over 2 years. And the idea is that whereas Banos Shuach are going to go and get ripe in the 3rd year, they're going to be considered Sheviis produce 2 years after Sheviis. And these dates are going to be ripening in the 2nd year, and they're going to be subject to the Sheviis requirements the year after Sheviis. And the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, Rabbi Yehuda's colleagues, said to him, they did not say this except with regards to Benuos Shuach. So the only species which the sages said that Sheviis status is going to apply only after Sheviis, but not during Sheviis, is going to be the Benos Shuach. So it is not clear why the sages, or what the sages' objection to Rabbi Yehuda's ruling is regarding these dates. Now, the question is, was the white fig going to be a hekish that's going to apply to other cases as well? And by the sages objecting to it, we see that if you have another fruit that would be emerging in the Sheviis year and getting ready in the next year, that would not be subject to the Sheviis sanctity in the 8th year, according to what the sages are saying. And so by putting in about these dates, it's discounting that this is going to be a hekish on, like the white figs, that are going to account for all other cases. And basically what the Mishnah is doing is it's only limiting it to this special case of the figs that are going to be taking 3 years to ripen. But if something is emerging in the Sheviis year and only ripens in the 8th year, so it has a 2-year cycle, it's not going to count. That is very interesting because you can no longer use the figs as a hekish for everything. It is limited. The Gemara is going to talk about these Benos Shuach, and it's going to ask, and it's going to say, what are Benos Shuach? And it's going to say, Pitir Riyah. And this is a Greek name for Benos Shuach. So a lot of times, unlike the Bavli, but a lot of times in the Yerushalmi. It's certainly a lot more common to have Greek in the Yerushalmi. It comes up a lot. And this is the Greek word for these kinds of figs. So the Mishnah now is stating that the Banos Shuach produce fruit over 3 years. And the Gemara asks and says, what does this mean? Does it mean that every year they produce fruit, or does it mean they produce fruit only once in 3 years? So what this is really saying is perhaps it could mean that the Mishnah is saying that these white fig trees are going to bring up new fruit and new figs every year, and that the difference between the white fig tree and other fruits is going to be that these are going to ripen 3 years later, and regular fruit trees are going to ripen every year, just like that peach tree example we were talking about in the north of Israel. The other way to read this is it going to be where in any given year these white fig trees could contain figs that are actually going to be in 3 stages of development, and that you're going to have some of them are going to be newly emerged, which would be coming from this year. Some would be from the year earlier, and some would be the year before that. Okay, so that's really what it's asking. It's trying to ask if these are bringing figs once every 3 years, or is it going to be that there's going to be a lot of figs growing all together, and some are going to be at different stages in this 3-year cycle. That's what it wants to ask. And the Gemara asks, and it says, how does anyone know which figs emerged during Sheviis? In other words, if at any given time they're all going to be on the fig tree at once from 3 different years, then if this were the case, how would you tell which would be the second year, which would be the first year, which would be the third year? And, it might not just be enough to just look at the fruit to tell whether it's ripe. You have to have a reliable way to identify which ones came during the Shemitah, because, first of all, you can't have a way where you can just taste it off the tree. Okay, that you can't do that. So you got to have a visual way to identify, because this is really a unusual case. How do you know which is which? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yonah says, once a fig emerges during Sheviis, he ties a ribbon to it, and then in the second year of the cycle, he knows that only those figs with a ribbon have Sheviis sanctity. And there's going to be a second way to do it. And Shmuel taught in a brisa, he embeds the Sheviis figs with splinters. And the brisa brings this up, says Amara Fulda, because tying ribbons on a Sheviis fig is not reliable, because the ribbon can turn brittle in the weather over 3 years and can fall off. And instead, they should take wood splinters and insert it into the fig when it emerges in Sheviis, and then you'll see, these splintered figs, and you'll be able to identify which is which. Now, in 6 years, where you have produce in Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be subject to tithing, okay? And in Sheviis, because this is going to be ownerless produce, this is not subject to tithing. Now, at the end of chapter 4, we were talking about what happens if you're cutting down trees. You're cutting down fruit trees, and you have mature, ripe fruit on it. Well, you'd say, well, wait a second. If you cut down the fruit tree early, you've wasted the fruit, and you've deprived the person of the ability to come and collect this fruit. So you've effectively stolen from the poor. Very serious. Although anybody can collect Sheviis produce, not just the poor, but it's really meant for the poor people. And if you're sitting there cutting it down when it's mature, the idea, you'd say, well, why aren't you just doing the same thing? Didn't you deprive the poor? And the answer is no, because you've allowed, once it became mature, the people can come and collect it. and they know about when things ripen, and they go up and they show up in the field to collect. Now, if the people don't show up and it's been, the time of readiness, then you can go cut it down because they've had the time to come and collect it. But they have to be able to identify which is going to be Sheviis produce and not. And so if you're coming to a fig tree and you're seeing one with splinters, you're seeing like, okay, this is available to be taken. Now, in the normal year, we have to separate tithes. We have to take out Meiser Sheni, and that's going to be in the first, second, fourth, and fifth. And then you have Meiser Ani in the third and the sixth year. And you have this variation in the cycle. And because of that, you have to identify the year of the Sheviis cycle and which fruit belongs to which. Because again, it can affect where you are in the tithing status. It can also affect when it is the seventh year produce, even if that seventh year produce is coming 2 years later, that the person is free to come and collect it. And so you have to set up a system where you can know, which fruit belongs to what. Now keep in mind, for Meiser Sheni, you can't tithe this year's fruit for that year's fruit. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to tithe this year's produce to that year's produce, also with grain, because like the Hadash or whatever, it has different value, and older grain doesn't have the same value and is not exactly the same. So you have to keep track of it, and you have to know, like, when does the Meiser start, or in this case, when does something have Sheviis sanctity. So when you're looking at, a plant's development that's going to come over many months, and then you're going to have a process that is going to be where Meiser in 1 year is going to end, and then, you might end up with Meiser Ani in the other year, and you're not sure which is which. You got to track it. And you have to be able to assign the fruit to a certain year, and otherwise you're not going to give the right tithe, or you might be ending up with something that really belongs to the poor. It's really heckish because it has this Sheviis sanctity. So that's what this Bryce is going to be covering. That's coming up related to fruit trees. And so it was taught in a Brisa that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, a tree that formed fruit before the 15th of Shvat is tithed according to the past year. And if it formed fruit after the 15th of Shvat, it is tithed according to the coming year. Now, I will say something amazing. Today is the 15th of Shvat. It is Tu B'Av. And we've been doing this shiur, and we have not been planning out what comes day by day. And here it is, actually the 15th of Shvat. And now, in the Gemara shiur, we are covering the laws of the 15th of Shvat. How amazing is that? So, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, a tree that forms fruit before the 15th of Shvat is tithed according to the past year. And if it formed fruit after the 15th of Shvat, it is tithed according to the coming year. So, this Tana, or the rabbis, are holding that the beginning of the year for trees is the 15th of Shvat. This, by the way, is the opinion of Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai says it's from the Rosh Chodesh of Shvat, but Bet Hillel says it's from the 15th of Shvat. And the 15th of Shvat is on trees when the sap gets to the top of the tree. And the opinion of Bet Hillel was when the base of the tree first starts to get the sap to start to go up the tree. So again, this is this debate between whether something happens in actuality, which is Bet Hillel, or in potentia, which is Bet Shammai. So this Tana is holding that the fruit tree is tied according to the year where the fruit emerges, okay? And basically what they're saying is that if you have a tree whose fruit emerges before the 15th of Shvat, it's going to be tied according to the past year, while the fruit who emerges after the 15th of Shvat is going to be tied according to the coming year. Keep in mind that when you have fruit that has maturity, okay, so a sapling can change the year for a sapling in Rosh Hashanah. But if it has fruit on the tree, okay, that fruit doesn't count. Let's say you're talking about an orla tree. On a regular orla tree, the fruit on that tree before the 15th of Shvat still counts like orla, and the fruit after is going to count in the next year. So if you have a fruit tree that comes up to Rosh Hashanah, and that would end the orla cycle, but there's fruit on it, you can't do anything with the fruit until the 15th of Shvat. So once that fruit of 15th of Shvat has passed, then it's gonna have, the sanctity where you're taking the first of the fruits, and that you're doing that. But it's possible to start to eat it after you've sanctified the fruit, and you've brought it to be sanctified. Anyway, so over here, as an example, let's say you have a year that's going out, and that's going to be the second year of the Sheviis cycle, okay? And then you have the third year of the Sheviis cycle coming in. So if you have fruit that comes in before the 15th of Shvat, it's going to be subject to Meiser Sheni. And if it emerges after the 15th of Shvat, it's going to be subject to Meiser Ani. And so that's going to be the idea. So, by the way, in the Orla, it would also be where the fruit emerges after the 15th of Shvat would not be subject to Orla, and the fruit that would be subject to Orla. So in this case, the Chazan Ish says about this in his commentary in Sheviis 7:11. It says that this is called Chanata, which occurs before the fruit becomes edible, and this is going to be where the formation of the fruit is, and it's going to refer to the point where the petals of the flower fall off, just revealing a newly formed fruit that begins to emerge in the place of the petals. And that's going to be the definition of this by the Chazan Ish. So this is what this is trying to describe at the 15th of Shvat. Now, there's going to be another Tana who's going to qualify this rule because it's not so simple. And it was taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Nehemiah says regarding what are these words said, regarding a type of tree that yields 2 harvests per year. So if you have a fig tree is going to be where fruit is going to be getting ready at many times. It's not going to be picked all at once, but actually it's going to be picked twice in a year. And in this case, if you had fruit that emerged before Tu B'Av, they would be picked earlier, while those that emerge after Tu B'Av are picked later. And each group is going to be stored separately. So also, like if you had Orla, if the fruit of the tree blossomed, let's say after Rosh Hashanah, but before Tu B'Av, and it was the third year of the cycle, that would be still subject to Orla. I'm sorry, let's say you had a fourth year tree, and it became to be Rosh Hashanah, but you had blossoms on it that came before Tu B'Av, then those fruits that were on there would be subject to Orla, and only the new blossoms in that fourth year after after Tu B'Av are going to be subject to not being Orlah. So again, this is going to be where fruit that's formed on the tree before the 15th of Shvat is tithed according to the past year. So that would also be, by the way, for Orlah, it would be like the last year. And if you have fruit that's forming after the 15th of Shvat, it's going to be the next year, because Tu B'Av is the Tu B'Shvat, not Tu B'Av. Tu B'Shvat is the new year for trees, and this is when fruit is going to count either as this is a cutoff. It's either going to count as the last year or the next year, and so it's going to be for tithes, but also for Orlah. So this clarification is talking about where you have multiple harvests on a tree. Fig trees are like that, where things are getting ready at multiple times. You also have certain types of stone fruit in the north that will be having multiple yields throughout the season. So, for instance, nectarines. I was in an orchard in the north, and nectarines are going to be gathered at multiple times through the year. Sometime in August, July, August, and even up till September. They're going to be gathered multiple times because they don't ripen all at one time where you can collect them all at once. Basically, the farmer comes and looks at a tree, and some will be ripe all of a sudden, whereas they weren't ripe before, and others are still getting ripe but are not ready to be picked yet. So this is going to be regarding a tree that has multiple harvests in a year. And the Gemara continues and says, but regarding a type of tree that yields only one harvest per year, such as an olive tree, a date palm, and a carob tree, even though they formed fruit before this time of the 15th of Shvat, they are tithed according to the future year. So if you have date palms, the clusters are all ready at once. They shake out the clusters, and they cut off the clusters, and the dates are all ready at the same time, and they can cut all the trees at the same time with these clusters, and that's how they harvest dates. It's not done where, like, this nectarine tree where it's making all the time, and you can't just come one day and finish the harvest. But on olive trees they do, date palms they do, carob trees they do. So in this kind of harvest, even though they form fruit before this time, they are tithed according to the future year. So if you have fruit of a single harvest, and they're going to be all stored together in the same bin, it would be assigned to the year where they initially emerge, and some of the fruits in the bin would be considered crop of the earlier year, and some would be of the later year. Again, that cutoff is Tu B'Shvat, and those that are emerging after Tu B'Shvat. So then, if you have a case where if you're taking, like, for dates, and you had some of the crop coming, and they didn't make this cutoff, and they were making you split it up into multiple years, you'd have a problem because, again, you can't take Meiser from this year for another year. So what they did on this single crop, and you can see this, by the way, in Rashi, Bavli, Rosh Hashanah 13b, the idea is that fruits of a single harvest are going to be tithed according to the coming year. And the idea is that the rabbis were empowered to fix the year of trees tithing as they saw fit, because the obligation to tithe the fruit tree is only rabbinic anyway, says Rashi. So since fruit that's going to emerge before Tu B'Shvat, and let's say it reaches a third of the growth after Tu B'Shvat, the idea is that if you had such a ruling where in a single harvest the trees would be tithed according to the earlier year, then you would end up where you had an issue, because it might mean that if you had a single harvest for trees, then if you had this critical stage where the fruit first emerges, and instead of being like where you can just eat it, then you're going to be assigning it to a different year. And so the worry is that let's say you took for these dates and you said, well, let's just do it where it's at least a third ready. Okay, it's a third ripe. It's a third of its growth for the fruit instead of the year it emerges. Okay, like for wheat, we know that it's a third of the growth, and we also know that it's, for other things as well, a third of the growth. So let's say you were to go by this third of the growth rule instead of when it emerges. Well, you might end up with a year where you're tithing it in the wrong year, and it would change the year it's tithed. So if you have fruit that emerges before Tu B'Av and after Rosh Hashanah, which by the way is going to be a difference of 4.5 months, the effect would be that if you had single harvest trees, they would be tithed according to the coming year. And so basically they wanted to do it where it's going to be for these where it's going to be harvested. So the idea here is that a single harvest tree is assigned not according to when the fruit emerges, but according to when they're picked. And that's going to be the idea. Rabbi Nehemiah is effectively saying that it's going to be the time of picking. It's not going to be the time of emerging, and that's going to change the tithing year. So the Gemara is going to comment about this, and Rabbi Yochanan says that the people have adopted the custom of following Rabbi Nehemiah in regards to carob trees. So Rabbi Yochanan's understanding Rabbi Nehemiah's statement about single harvest trees that are tithed according to the future year to mean that such trees are tithed according to the point at which the fruits reach a third of their growth rather than when the fruits emerged, which is different from what the earlier Baraisa was. And based on this understanding, this has become like part of the custom of the people to follow Rabbi Nehemiah on the carob trees, according to Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish posed a challenge in the presence of Rabbi Yochanan and said, but we learned in the Mishnah that Banos Shuach, which is what this Mishnah is here, their Sheviis is the second year after the Sheviis cycle, and that's because they produce fruit over 3 years. Now, if Banuos Shuach are a single harvest type of tree, so in other words, normal fig trees are harvested 2 times a year, but what's different is these Banuos Shuach trees are different in that all of the figs that ripen in any given year are going to be picked at the same time, even if it's over even if it's going to be growing on the tree at 3 different stages. You're going to harvest all of it at once, and you're not going to harvest the earlier season because they're not ready. So if it's a very slow 3-year cycle, and it's the 3rd year in the cycle, you're only going to harvest the 3rd year tree's fruits with the splinters in it. You're going to leave the other fruits because they're so slow growing, they're not ready. So it's going to count as a single harvest. That's the idea of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. The Gemara says, according to this opinion of what Rabbi Yochanan's proposing, what they produced during Sheviis, meaning those figs that reached a third of their growth during Sheviis, and not those that merely emerged during Sheviis, would be considered Sheviis produce. And Rabbi Yochanan accepted this challenge from him in silence. So this is a case where Rabbi Yochanan actually listened to the objection of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So what he's arguing is that if figs that possess Sheviis sanctity should be those that were picked the first year after Sheviis, which emerged 2 years before the Sheviis, and not those that were picked 2 years after Sheviis, then basically you'd be saying that it has different year sanctity. That's what he'd be arguing. Now, Rabbi Yochanan's reaction gets questioned here, and Rabbi Bon Bar Kana says, and I wonder how it can be that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish posed this challenge in the presence of Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan accepted it from him, and why Rabbi Yochanan should have just countered, I speak of carob trees, and you reply concerning the Benos Shuach fig trees. And I speak of the custom people adopted, and you reply by citing Halacha. And I speak of the opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah, and you reply by citing a Mishnah that follows the view of the rabbis. Now, that's a good objection. There's going to be another way to try to explain Rabbi Yochanan's acceptance of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's argument. The Gemara says that rather, since Rabbi Yochanan accepted Rish Lakish's challenge in silence, it is apparent that he held that carob trees are the same as Benos Shuach, and that the custom is the same as the halacha, and that Rabbi Nehemiah is the same as the rabbis. In other words, that yes, it's true that Rabbi Yochanan mentioned only the carobs, and that the Meiser obligation on that is only going to be rabbinic, but Rabbi Yochanan felt that this is not a reason for them to assign a different critical stage than Benos Shuach, whose Sheviis obligation actually is biblical. The biblical obligation on the fig trees, on figs from the Torah, that's going to be biblical. But carobs are not going to be a biblical obligation. That's going to be a rabbinic obligation, because carob trees are not actually listed in the types of trees for which Sheviis sanctity takes hold. So when you're saying that people have a custom to follow Rabbi Nehemiah, Rabbi Yochanan is meaning that it's actually going to be a halacha. Now, in the Bavli, Rosh Hashanah 15b, it's going to add to this. And it's going to say that Rabbi Yochanan would have not permitted the public to continue to follow a practice that was with odds of the halacha. And basically, the idea is that Rabbi Yochanan is really understanding that Rabbi Nehemiah was not disputing the rabbi's opinions, but just trying to explain it. And upon hearing Rish Lakish's challenge from this Mishnah, proving that even a single harvest tree is going to be assigned according to the fruit's chanata, and not according to when the fruits reach a third of the growth, Rabbi Yochanan was at a loss for an answer. So the Marafulda is going to explain this. Okay, Rabbi Nehemiah did not mean to say that if you have a single harvest tree, that the stage that determines which year the fruit is going to be assigned is going to be different for a dual harvest tree or a multiple harvest tree. So the idea is that if you have a critical stage for all trees, it's going to be at the point at which the fruit is going to emerge. And Rabbi Nehemiah means that if you have a dual harvest tree, the new year is going to begin on the 15th of Shvat. That's Tu B'Shvat. And regarding a single harvest tree, it's going to commence the 1st of Tishrei. That's going to be the Rosh Hashanah of the world. And the result in all the fruits of such trees being tithed is going to be to the coming year, even fruit that emerges before Tu B'Av and emerges after Rosh Hashanah. Again, let me say that again. This is the note by the Marafulda. The result is that all the fruits of these single harvest trees are going to be tithed according to the coming year. because even if the fruit emerges before Tu B'Av, it emerges after Rosh Hashanah. So we have to look into a single harvest tree for what the law of Orlah would be. So the Gemara is going to question this, and Rabbi Yudan Bar Palia challenges the interpretation of the presence of Rabbi Yonah and says why carob trees form fruit from before Rosh Hashanah of the world, yet they are also tithed according to the coming year. So the idea here is that, yes, most fruits do form the fruit after Rosh Hashanah, and the carob tree will actually form the fruit before Rosh Hashanah, which also is another odd thing about carob trees. Carob tree keeps coming up as an oddity in Jewish law. So another one of these oddities is going to be that the fruit starts to get formed before Rosh Hashanah, whereas regular trees are going to form the fruit after Rosh Hashanah. And Rabbi Nehemiah is stating that the carob trees are going to be tithed according to the coming year. So according to Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, where you're talking about Rabbi Nehemiah's understanding that a single harvest tree is going to be tithed according to when the fruit attains a third of the growth, there's not a problem because even carobs do not attain 1/3 of their growth until the coming year. That's going to be after Tu B'Shvat. But if Rabbi Nehemiah agrees that regarding a single harvest tree that follows the year of the emergence, and the reason they're going to be tied according to the coming year is that the Rosh Hashanah, the new year, is Rosh Hashanah, the ruling becomes hard to understand because the emergence of carobs comes before Rosh Hashanah. So we learned before that it's going to be when the chains are going to be formed on the carob trees, not when it's going to be tied. So you might end up with a case with a single harvest tree where you have a different Orlah time, and on a multiple harvest tree, you're going to have a different time for calculating Orlah. So in the case of the multiple harvest tree, if the fruits are going to emerge before Tu B'Shvat, it's going to be tithed in the previous year, and it's going to be subject to the previous year. And if it's going to emerge after Tu B'Shvat, it's going to count as the next year. So if you have a fruit tree that's going to be at this cutoff on the third year and it's going to produce multiple fruit, it may not have the same calculation on Orlah as a single harvest tree. So that's very interesting, and we have to look at that more. Anyway, have a great day.